Every so often, international politics produces a country that divides the world so cleanly, so completely, that the division itself becomes the story. Not the country's history, not its government's decisions, not even its military capabilities. Just the raw fact that one half of the world looks at it and sees a threat, while the other half looks at the same country and sees something closer to a partner. Iran is that country. And today, on the Policy Room, we are going to spend serious time understanding why. Not who is right, not who is wrong, but why the divide exists, what it reveals, and what it means for the way the international system actually functions in the 21st century. I'm Daniel Carter, and if you are watching this for the first time, what we do on this channel is take the questions that matter most in global affairs and work through them carefully, without the noise, without the politics, and without the shortcuts. Today's question is one I have wanted to explore for a long time, because it sits at the intersection of history, power, economics, and ideology all at once. Why do some countries support Iran while others oppose it? That question sounds simple. The answer, as we are going to discover today, is anything but. My guest today is Professor Linda Nasseri, a professor of international relations at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs, based here in New York. Professor Nasseri's work focuses on Iranian foreign policy and the economics of international sanctions. She is one of the relatively rare scholars who approaches Iran not from a purely Washington-centric perspective, but from a genuinely comparative international relations framework, asking not just what the United States thinks about Iran, but why countries across 4 continents reach such different conclusions about the same government. Professor Nasseri, welcome to the Policy Room.
Thank you, Daniel. I have to say, the framing you just used, that the divide itself is the story, is exactly right. And it is a framing that gets lost very quickly in most policy conversations. We tend to jump straight to Iran's behavior, Iran's nuclear program, Iran's regional activities. All of that matters enormously. But if we never stop to ask why intelligent governments with real strategic interests reach such opposite conclusions about Iran, we are missing the most important analytical layer. And I think your audience deserves that layer.
Let me give our audience a concrete image to hold on to as we begin. Picture 2 news events happening in the same week, which, if you follow this issue, is not a hypothetical. It happens regularly. On one side, the United States Treasury Department is announcing a fresh package of sanctions against Iranian entities, using language about regional destabilization and nuclear escalation. On the other side, a government in Southeast Asia or East Africa is finalizing a bilateral trade agreement with Tehran, with ministers shaking hands and talking about mutual development. Same Iran. Same week. Opposite responses. When you see that image, Professor, what is your immediate analytical reaction?
My immediate reaction is that both of those governments are being entirely rational. That is the first thing I want to establish clearly. This is not a situation where one side understands Iran and the other side is confused or naive. Both governments are responding logically to their own national interests, their own historical experiences, and their own reading of what the international system requires of them. The problem is that those interests, those experiences, and those readings are genuinely different. And until we understand how they differ, and why, we cannot make sense of anything else about Iran's place in the world.
That word, rational, is going to be important throughout this conversation. Because I think one of the default assumptions in a lot of Western coverage of Iran is that countries which maintain relationships with Tehran are either naive or corrupt, or somehow failing to see what Washington sees clearly. You are pushing back on that assumption from the very beginning.
Firmly pushing back. And I want to be precise about why. When I say those governments are rational, I am not saying Iran's government is without serious problems. The human rights record is genuinely troubling. The support for armed proxy groups across the Middle East is documented and consequential. The nuclear program raises real questions that cannot be dismissed. None of that is in dispute. What I am saying is that a government in, say, Malaysia or Senegal or Brazil looks at that same set of facts and weighs them against a completely different set of national priorities. energy access, trade diversification, historical solidarity, skepticism of American sanctions architecture, and reaches a different conclusion. That is not naivety. That is foreign policy.
So the divide over Iran is not really a divide over the facts about Iran. It is a divide over which facts matter most, and to whom.
Precisely. And I would go one step further. The divide over Iran is, at its deepest level, a divide about the international order itself, about who built it, who benefits from it, who enforces it, and who feels excluded by it. Iran has very deliberately positioned itself as a symbol of resistance to American-led global governance. That positioning irritates Washington enormously. But for a significant portion of the world, countries with their own histories of foreign interference, economic coercion, and marginalization from global decision-making, that positioning carries real resonance, not because they share Iran's revolutionary ideology, but because they recognize the pattern.
That is a framing that I suspect will genuinely surprise some of our audience. And it is exactly the kind of analytical reorientation that makes this conversation worth having. We are going to spend the rest of this episode unpacking every layer of that divide. The historical roots, the regional fault lines, the great power competition, the nuclear dimension, and the question of where all of this goes from here. But before we go anywhere, I want to ask you the question that I think anchors everything. You have studied Iran from outside the Washington consensus for years. What is the single most important thing that most people get wrong about why the world is divided over Iran?
The most important mistake is treating the divide as though it is primarily about Iran's behavior. It is not. Iran's behavior is the surface. Underneath it, the divide is about something much larger and much more structural. It is about which countries feel represented by the current international system, and which countries feel that system was designed to serve other people's interests. Iran has spent 4 decades exploiting that structural resentment with considerable skill. It presents itself not as an aggressive revolutionary state, though that is how Washington frames it, but as a sovereign nation that refused to submit to external dictation and paid an enormous economic price for that refusal. For many governments around the world, that narrative is not propaganda. It is a story they recognize from their own national experience.
And that recognition, as we are going to see, shapes everything, from how Russia and China engage with Tehran to how the global South navigates American sanctions pressure, to why Europe has consistently tried to maintain its own independent diplomatic channel with Iran, even when Washington pushed hard against it. We have a lot of ground to cover today. But I think we have established exactly the right foundation to build on. The divide over Iran is real, it is structural, and it tells us something important about the world we are actually living in. Not the world we assumed we built after 1991. Professor Nasseri, let's go deeper. Because the place where this story really begins is not 1979, and it is not the nuclear program. It goes back much further than that. And understanding that history changes everything about how you read the present. Let me ask you something that I think gets overlooked in most conversations about Iran. When Western analysts talk about Iranian foreign policy, the nuclear program, the proxy networks, the resistance to sanctions, they almost always start the clock in 1979, the Islamic Revolution, Khomeini, the hostage crisis. That is treated as the origin point. But you have argued, and I think convincingly, that starting in 1979 is actually an analytical mistake. That to understand how Iran sees the world today, you have to go back much further. So take us back. Where does this story actually begin?
It begins with identity. And I know that sounds abstract, so let me make it concrete. Iran is not a modern nation-state that emerged from colonialism in the 20th century. It is one of the oldest continuous civilizations on Earth. The Persian Empire, Cyrus, Darius, Xerxes, predates the Roman Empire by centuries. That is not a historical footnote. It is an active, living part of how Iranians understand themselves and their place in the world. When Iranian leaders, across the political spectrum, not just hardliners, talk about Iran's right to be treated as a major power, they are drawing on a civilizational self-perception that is thousands of years deep. That context matters for everything that follows.
And yet, despite that ancient civilizational identity, the 19th and 20th centuries were not kind to Iran in terms of actual sovereignty. Can you walk us through what that period looked like from Tehran's perspective?
The 19th century was, from Iran's perspective, a prolonged experience of being treated as an object rather than a subject of international politics. Britain and Russia, the two dominant imperial powers of that era, competed aggressively for influence over Iranian territory, Iranian trade routes, and Iranian government decisions. There is a term historians use for this competition: the Great Game. Iran was never formally colonized the way India or much of Africa was, but it was consistently carved up, pressured, and manipulated by outside powers, who had no interest in Iranian sovereignty and every interest in Iranian resources and geography. That experience left a very deep institutional memory.
When you say institutional memory, what do you mean exactly? Because I think that phrase is important, but can sound vague to people who are not familiar with how foreign policy cultures actually work.
It is a fair challenge. What I mean is this: governments, like people, carry the memory of past experiences into their current decisions. When Iranian foreign policy officials sit across the table from American or British negotiators today, they are not operating in a historical vacuum. They are operating with a mental framework shaped by generations of experience in which outside powers promised one thing and delivered another, in which agreements were signed and then violated when they became inconvenient, and in which Iranian sovereignty was treated as negotiable whenever it conflicted with Western interests. That memory is institutionalized. It is taught in schools, reinforced in political culture, and deeply embedded in how Iranian decision-makers interpret foreign intentions.
And the event that sits at the absolute center of that institutional memory, the one that comes up again and again whenever you talk to Iranian officials or Iranian scholars, is 1953, the coup. Can you explain what happened and why it carries such extraordinary weight?
The 1953 coup is, without question, the single most important historical event for understanding Iranian distrust of the West. And I want to explain it carefully, because it is frequently referenced but rarely explained with the precision it deserves. In 1951, Iran's parliament elected Mohammad Mossadegh as prime minister. Mossadegh was a nationalist Democrat, educated, broadly popular, and committed to a very specific goal: nationalizing Iran's oil industry, which at that point was effectively controlled by the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, a British enterprise that was extracting Iranian oil and returning very little of the revenue to the Iranian people. Mossadegh's nationalization was enormously popular inside Iran. It was also legal under international law as it was developing at the time. But it threatened British economic interests very directly. Britain lobbied the United States aggressively, framing Mossadegh not as a nationalist Democrat, but as a potential communist sympathizer who might align Iran with the Soviet Union. The Eisenhower administration, in the early years of the Cold War, found that framing persuasive. In August 1953, the CIA and British intelligence, MI6, orchestrated a coup that removed Mossadegh from power. He spent the rest of his life under house arrest. The Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, was restored to the throne and ruled with American support for the next 26 years.
The United States government has since formally acknowledged its role in that coup. But I want to make sure our audience understands why it matters so much for the present, not just as a historical grievance, but as an active factor in Iranian strategic thinking today. Why does 1953 still matter in 2024?
It matters for a very specific reason. Mossadegh was not a radical. He was not an Islamist. He was not anti-Western in any ideological sense. He was a democratically elected leader pursuing a completely legitimate national interest, control over his own country's natural resources. And he was removed not because he threatened Western security, but because he threatened Western economic interests. That distinction is crucial. It tells Iranians, and it has told every Iranian government since, that when Western powers talk about democracy, sovereignty, and international law, those values are conditional. They apply when they are convenient. When they are not convenient, they are set aside. That lesson has never been forgotten.
And the 26 years of American-backed Shah rule that followed the coup. How does that period feed into the revolutionary moment of 1979?
Directly and causally. The Shah's government, SAVAK, his internal intelligence service, was brutal by any honest accounting. Political dissidents were imprisoned, tortured, and killed. Civil liberties were systematically suppressed. And all of this happened with full American knowledge and consistent American support, because the Shah was strategically valuable. He kept Soviet influence out of Iran, he kept oil flowing, and he bought American weapons in enormous quantities. For ordinary Iranians who lived through that period, the connection was not abstract. American rhetoric about freedom and human rights meant nothing when American money and American weapons were sustaining the government that was repressing them.
So when Khomeini's revolution comes in 1979, it is not erupting from nowhere. It is erupting from a very specific, historically accumulated set of experiences.
Exactly. And this is a point I feel strongly about because it gets misrepresented constantly. The 1979 revolution was not simply a religious uprising. It was a nationalist revolution with a religious leadership. A very large portion of the people who participated in the revolution, students, intellectuals, leftists, merchants, women, were not primarily motivated by Islamic ideology. They were motivated by the accumulated experience of foreign interference, authoritarian repression, and the specific humiliation of watching their country's sovereignty treated as an American asset to be managed rather than a right to be respected. Khomeini provided the organizational capacity and the ideological framework, but the fuel was historical and political, not purely theological.
That distinction between the religious framework and the nationalist fuel underneath it feels important for understanding how Iran's foreign policy has evolved. Because Iranian foreign policy since 1979 has been remarkably consistent in certain ways, even as governments have changed and different factions have competed for power internally.
That consistency is one of the most analytically important things about Iran, and it points to what I think is the key concept for understanding Iranian behavior in the international system. I call it strategic autonomy as a survival value. For Iran's leadership, across factions, across decades, maintaining genuine independence from great power control is not simply a policy preference that can be traded away in negotiations. It is an existential commitment. It is the lesson that the country drew from 1953, from the Shah period, from the Iran-Iraq War, from decades of sanctions. The lesson is, the moment you allow your security or your economy to become dependent on outside powers, you become vulnerable to exactly the kind of interference that has repeatedly destabilized Iranian sovereignty.
And that survival value, that deep commitment to strategic autonomy, explains things about Iranian behavior that otherwise seem irrational or self-defeating. The refusal to make concessions under maximum pressure, the investment in proxy networks, the pursuit of nuclear capability even at enormous economic cost.
Precisely. These are not the choices of a government that is simply aggressive or ideologically fanatical, though ideology certainly plays a role. They are the choices of a government that has a very specific, historically grounded theory of how outside powers behave, and that has structured its entire security architecture around never being as vulnerable as it was in 1953. Whether that theory leads to good outcomes for the Iranian people is a completely separate question. It often does not. But understanding the logic is the prerequisite for any serious analysis of Iranian foreign policy. You cannot design effective policy toward a government whose decision-making framework you fundamentally misunderstand.
That is an incredibly important foundation to have established before we go any further. Because everything we are going to discuss, the sanctions, the nuclear program, the proxy networks, the relationships with Russia and China, all of it makes more sense when you understand that Iran is not operating from a blank slate. It is operating from a very specific historical experience that shapes every calculation its government makes. And as we move forward, We are going to see how that historical experience collides with the interests of the United States, of regional powers, and of the broader international system. Because the story of how Iran sees the world is really just the beginning. The more complex question is how the world has chosen to respond, and why those responses are so dramatically and so consequentially different from one another. So, we have established the foundation. Iran enters the modern era carrying a civilizational identity, a deep institutional memory of foreign interference, and a revolutionary ideology that made the United States its principal adversary almost overnight in 1979. And that brings us to what I think is the gravitational center of this entire conversation. Because before we can understand why Russia supports Iran, or why Saudi Arabia opposes it, or why the global South navigates carefully around it, we have to understand the relationship that sits underneath all of those other relationships. The conflict between Washington and Tehran. Professor Nasseri, how do you characterize that relationship in its most essential terms?
I characterize it as a structured hostility that has become, in a very meaningful sense, self-sustaining. And I want to unpack that phrase carefully, because I think it explains more about the current situation than almost any other single concept. The U.S.-Iran relationship has been in a state of active antagonism for 45 years. That is not a temporary diplomatic rupture that can be repaired with a change of administration or a well-crafted agreement. It is a relationship that has generated its own institutional momentum, its own bureaucracies, its own domestic political constituencies, its own embedded assumptions about the other side's intentions. Both governments have built their regional strategies around the assumption of continued hostility. Reversing that is not simply a matter of political will.
Let's be specific about what that hostility looks like from the American side, because I want our audience to understand that the U.S. position on Iran is not invented or arbitrary. There are documented, specific reasons why successive American administrations, Democratic and Republican, have maintained a posture of containment and pressure toward Tehran. What are the core American concerns?
They are real and they are serious, and I want to state them clearly. The United States designates Iran as the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism, and that designation is backed by substantial evidence. Iran provides funding, weapons, training, and strategic direction to Hezbollah in Lebanon, which has conducted attacks that have killed American citizens and soldiers. It supports Hamas in Gaza, the Houthi movement in Yemen, and a network of Shia militia groups in Iraq and Syria that have repeatedly targeted American military personnel. These are not allegations. They are documented relationships with documented consequences. Any honest analysis of the U.S.-Iran conflict has to begin by acknowledging that these concerns are grounded in reality.
And beyond the proxy networks, there is the nuclear dimension, which we are going to explore in depth later in this conversation. But even setting that aside, the list of specific Iranian actions that have generated American hostility is substantial.
It is. The 1979 hostage crisis, 52 American diplomats held for 444 days, was a foundational trauma in the American public's relationship with Iran that has never fully faded. Iranian-backed groups were responsible for the 1983 Beirut barracks bombing that killed 241 American service members. Iran has repeatedly attempted to assassinate American officials and Iranian dissidents on American soil. It has conducted cyber attacks against American financial institutions, and its explicit, consistent, decades-long rhetorical commitment to the destruction of Israel, America's closest ally in the region, creates a political environment in Washington where any administration that appears to soften toward Iran faces immediate and intense domestic political pressure.
So, the American case against Iran is not a manufactured foreign policy consensus. It is built on a specific, documented history of hostile actions. And yet, and this is where the analysis gets genuinely complex, Iran has its own catalog of grievances against the United States that is equally specific and equally documented. Can you walk us through that side of the ledger?
I can, and I think it is essential to do so. Not to create a false moral equivalence, but because you cannot understand Iranian decision-making without understanding what Tehran believes it is. Responding to. The 1953 coup sits at the top of that list, as we discussed. But the catalog does not end there. During the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, a war in which Iraq under Saddam Hussein used chemical weapons against Iranian soldiers and Kurdish civilians, the United States provided Iraq with intelligence, diplomatic cover, and dual-use technology. Washington knew chemical weapons were being used. It continued its support anyway, because Iran was considered the greater strategic threat. From Tehran's perspective, the United States actively facilitated war crimes against Iranian people. In 1988, the USS Vincennes shot down Iran Air Flight 655, killing all 290 civilians on board. The United States initially denied responsibility, then acknowledged it was an accident, and awarded the ship's commander a medal, an act that Iranian officials still reference as evidence of American contempt for Iranian lives. The sanctions regime that has been in place in various forms since 1979 has caused genuine, documented economic hardship for ordinary Iranian citizens, limiting their access to medicines, restricting their ability to participate in the global economy, and contributing to a standard of living that has declined significantly from what it was before the revolution. These are not propaganda points, they are historical facts.
So both sides have a genuine, historically grounded case that the other has acted in ways that justify defensive and retaliatory responses. And this is where I want to introduce the concept you mentioned earlier, the security dilemma, because I think it helps explain how two sides can both be responding rationally to threat and still produce a relationship that is deeply irrational in its overall trajectory.
The security dilemma is one of the most important concepts in international relations, and the US-Iran relationship is almost a textbook illustration of it. The basic logic is this: when one actor takes steps to increase its own security, those steps are often perceived by the other side as threatening, which causes the other side to take its own defensive measures, which are then perceived as threatening by the first side, and so the cycle escalates. Neither side is purely the aggressor. Both sides are responding to what they genuinely perceive as threats. But the cumulative result is a spiral of mutual hostility that produces outcomes neither side would have chosen if they had been able to coordinate.
Give us a concrete example of how that spiral has worked in the US-Iran context.
Iran develops long-range ballistic missiles. The United States and its allies frame this as offensive aggression, a delivery system for future nuclear warheads. Iran frames it as defensive deterrence against a United States that has demonstrated in Iraq and Libya a willingness to use military force to remove governments it considers hostile. The United States imposes additional sanctions in response to the missile program. Iran, facing economic pressure and what it perceives as an escalating American campaign for regime change, accelerates its nuclear enrichment program to create leverage. The United States interprets the accelerated enrichment as confirmation of aggressive intent. Each step follows a defensive logic on its own terms. The aggregate result is 45 years of escalating mutual hostility.
And this spiral has a domestic political dimension on both sides that makes it even harder to break. Can you explain how the internal politics of both countries work to sustain the conflict?
This is genuinely important, and it is underappreciated in most public discussions. In the United States, the domestic political environment around Iran is deeply constrained. The pro-Israel lobby, the Gulf Arab Alliance Network, the Iranian-American diaspora community, which is largely hostile to the Islamic Republic, and a bipartisan congressional consensus that views Iran as an irredeemable threat, all create powerful structural pressure against any administration that attempts serious diplomatic engagement. Obama paid an enormous political price for the JCPOA. Biden's attempt to restore it was effectively killed by domestic opposition before Iranian maximalism finished the job. Any American president who wants to negotiate with Iran is immediately accused of appeasement. On the Iranian side, the dynamic is mirror image. The Revolutionary Guards, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, have built an enormous economic empire inside Iran that is partially sustained by the sanctions environment. Sanctions reduce competition from foreign companies, which benefits IRGC-controlled enterprises. Hardline factions within the Iranian system have a direct material interest in continued hostility with the United States. And any Iranian leader who engages seriously with Washington, as Rouhani did with the JCPOA, is immediately accused by hardliners of betraying the revolution. The domestic politics of both countries systematically reward those who escalate and punish those who negotiate.
That structural point, that powerful actors on both sides have material interests in continued hostility, is one of the most sobering things about the US-Iran relationship. It suggests that the conflict is not simply a misunderstanding that better diplomacy could resolve. It has institutional roots that go very deep.
It does. And I want to add one more dimension that I think is essential for understanding why every other country's position on Iran flows from this central conflict. The United States is not simply one player in the Iran dispute. It is the architect and enforcer of the international sanctions architecture that surrounds Iran. The U.S. dollar's dominance in global finance gives Washington the ability to impose what are called secondary sanctions, penalties on third-country companies and banks that do business with Iran, even if those transactions have nothing to do with the United States. That extraterritorial reach is enormously powerful. It means that any country that wants to maintain normal economic relations with the United States faces real pressure to limit its engagement with Tehran, regardless of its own foreign policy preferences.
And that extraterritorial reach of American sanctions, the ability to penalize companies in other countries for doing business with Iran, is one of the primary drivers of resentment toward American Iran, policy in the global south, and even among American allies in Europe. It is experienced not as legitimate international pressure, but as an overextension of American power into sovereign foreign policy decisions.
Precisely. And that resentment creates a dynamic where countries that might otherwise be indifferent to Iran find themselves pushed toward a more sympathetic posture. Not because they support Iran's government or its policies, but because they object to the mechanism being used to pressure them. The secondary sanctions issue is in many ways as important as any specific Iranian action in explaining why the global divide over Iran has become so entrenched. It has turned what might have been a narrower dispute about Iranian nuclear and regional behavior into a much broader argument about American power, dollar dominance, and the limits of national sovereignty in a U.S.-led international system.
That is a critical analytical bridge, from the bilateral US-Iran conflict to the broader global divide, and it sets up everything we are going to explore in the sections ahead. Because once you understand that the US-Iran conflict is not just about two countries, but about the structure of the international system itself, the positions of Russia, China, Europe, the Gulf states, and the global south all start to make a great deal more sense. The conflict between Washington and Tehran is the fault line. Everything else is the landscape it has shaped. And as we move forward, we are going to see exactly how different parts of the world have positioned themselves along that landscape, and why those positions are driven by interests that are far more complex and far more rational than they are usually given credit for being. We have spent the last part of our conversation mapping the central fault line, the US-Iran conflict, and the structural logic that sustains it. Now I want to move to what I think is one of the most consequential developments in contemporary geopolitics. Because Iran does not exist in isolation. It has built relationships, serious, strategic, militarily significant relationships, with two of the most powerful countries in the world, Russia and China. And when you look at those relationships carefully, what you find is not an ideological alliance built on shared values. What you find is something more calculated, more pragmatic, and in some ways more durable than ideology. Professor Nasseri, how do you characterize the Iran-Russia-China alignment at its core?
I characterize it as a convergence of strategic interests among three states that each, for different reasons, have concluded that limiting American global primacy serves their national interests. And I want to be very precise about that framing. Because the word alliance gets used constantly in Western media to describe this relationship, and I think it is genuinely misleading. An alliance implies shared values, mutual defense commitments, and deep institutional coordination. None of those things fully describe what exists between Iran, Russia, and China. What exists is something more specific and more transactional, a set of overlapping interests that make cooperation rational without making it unconditional or without internal tension.
Let's take Russia first, because the Russia-Iran relationship has transformed most dramatically and most visibly in recent years. How would you describe what that relationship looked like before February 2022, and how has it changed since?
Before the Ukraine invasion, Russia and Iran had a cooperative but carefully managed relationship. Russia valued the 2015 nuclear deal, the JCPOA, partly because it gave Moscow a formal role as a mediator and guarantor in the negotiations, which enhanced Russian diplomatic prestige at a time when its relationship with the West was already deteriorating. Russia also sold Iran the S-300 air defense system after years of deliberate delay, using the prospect of that sale as diplomatic leverage. And Russia cooperated with Iran in Syria, where both governments supported the Assad regime. But the relationship had real limits. Russia was cautious about giving Iran capabilities that might destabilize regions where Russia also had interests, particularly the Caucasus and Central Asia. After February 2022, that calculus changed with remarkable speed. Russia's invasion of Ukraine triggered the most comprehensive Western sanctions package ever applied to a major economy. Russia found itself isolated from Western financial markets, Western technology supply chains, and Western diplomatic forums. In that environment, Iran, which had spent decades developing strategies for operating under sanctions, became genuinely valuable to Moscow. Not as a junior partner, but as a country with specific capabilities that Russia urgently needed. Most importantly, Iran had a domestic drone manufacturing industry that was producing systems Russia could use immediately on the battlefield in Ukraine.
And that drone relationship, Iran supplying Russia with Shahed series loitering munitions, became one of the most concrete and consequential military technology transfers of the entire Ukraine conflict. Can you explain what those weapons are and why they matter strategically?
The Shahed drones, particularly the Shahed 136, are relatively inexpensive, one-way attack drones designed to fly to a target and detonate on impact. They are not sophisticated by the standards of American or Israeli military technology, but they are effective, they are produced in large numbers, and they are very difficult to intercept cost-effectively, because the cost of the intercepting missile is often far greater than the cost of the drone itself. Russia has used them extensively against Ukrainian power infrastructure, civilian energy systems, and military logistics. The strategic effect has been significant, not in the sense of winning battles, but in the sense of degrading Ukrainian civilian resilience and stretching air defense resources.
And, in exchange for those drones and artillery ammunition, what has Iran received from Russia? Because this is a two-way transaction, and the Iranian side of it has implications that extend well beyond Ukraine.
The exchange has reportedly included several categories of Russian capability transfer. Advanced radar systems that significantly enhance Iran's air defense network. Technology related to the Su-35 fighter aircraft, which would represent a generational upgrade over Iran's current air force, much of which consists of aging American equipment purchased before 1979 and Chinese and Russian aircraft from the 1990s. And perhaps most significantly, satellite intelligence and space technology cooperation, which matters enormously for Iran's ability to monitor regional military movements, including Israeli and American force deployments. These are not trivial additions to Iranian military capability. They represent qualitative improvements in areas where Iran has had significant vulnerabilities.
So the Russia-Iran military relationship has moved from arms sales and diplomatic coordination to something that looks much more like an active strategic partnership, with real military technology flowing in both directions. How does that change the regional calculation for countries like Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the Gulf states?
it changes it significantly. Before this technology transfer dynamic accelerated, Iran's military capabilities, while considerable, had well-known limitations. Its air force was aging. Its air defense had gaps. Its precision strike capability was real but constrained. A Russia-enhanced Iran with better radar, better aircraft, and better satellite intelligence is a meaningfully different threat environment for every country in the region. Israel, in particular, has based much of its military planning on the assumption of Iranian technological inferiority in certain domains. That assumption is becoming less reliable, and it is one of the reasons why Israeli military planners have become more rather than less willing to consider preemptive action, because the window in which Iran's capabilities are manageable may be narrowing.
Now, let's turn to China, because the China-Iran relationship operates on a very different logic. It is less overtly military and more fundamentally economic. How would you characterize what China is doing with Iran, and why?
China's relationship with Iran is primarily about energy, infrastructure, and strategic positioning, and it is conducted with enormous care to manage American reactions. China is Iran's largest trading partner by a considerable margin. Chinese companies have continued to purchase Iranian oil throughout the sanctions periods, providing Tehran with the foreign currency revenue that has allowed it to fund its government, its military, and its regional proxy network. Without Chinese oil purchases, the economic pressure of American sanctions would be dramatically more severe. China essentially provides Iran with a sanctions relief valve that the United States has been unable to close.
And there is a formal architecture to this relationship now, the 2021 Comprehensive Strategic Partnership. Can you explain what that agreement actually involves and what it signals about the long-term trajectory of the China-Iran relationship?
The 25-year Comprehensive Strategic Partnership, signed in 2021, is a framework agreement that reportedly involves substantial Chinese investment in Iranian infrastructure, ports, railways, telecommunications, energy development, in exchange for access to discounted Iranian oil over an extended period. The precise financial figures have never been fully confirmed publicly, but analysts who have studied the agreement closely suggest it could involve investment in the range of hundreds of billions of dollars over its full term. What it signals, more than any specific financial commitment, is that China views Iran as a long-term strategic asset worth protecting, not just a trading partner to be managed cautiously, but a relationship worth formalizing and deepening despite American pressure.
Why would China take that risk? Because maintaining this relationship does create friction with Washington. It does expose Chinese companies to the threat of secondary sanctions. Why is Iran worth that cost to Beijing?
Several reasons, and they operate at different levels of Chinese strategic thinking. At the most immediate level, Iran provides China with a source of discounted energy that is not dependent on American goodwill or safe passage through sea lanes that the U.S. Navy dominates. China imports enormous quantities of oil, and reducing its dependence on suppliers that are vulnerable to American pressure is a straightforward energy security priority. At a deeper level, China fundamentally disputes the legitimacy of unilateral American sanctions. Beijing's position, stated consistently, and I think sincerely, is that only UN Security Council sanctions carry international legal standing, and that the United States has no legal authority to dictate who China trades with. But there is a third level that I think is the most strategically significant. Iran functions for China as what I would describe as a pressure valve in the relationship with Washington. By maintaining and even deepening its Iran relationship, China signals to the United States that American pressure on China, over Taiwan, over trade, over technology, will have costs. Iran is one of several relationships China uses to demonstrate that it has options, that it cannot simply be dictated to, and that American attempts to build a coalition of pressure against China will be met with countermoves. Iran is not just an energy supplier, it is a geopolitical instrument.
That framing, Iran as a geopolitical instrument in China's broader competition with the United States, is genuinely illuminating. It helps explain why the China-Iran relationship has deepened, even during periods when Iranian behavior has been particularly provocative by international standards. China is not endorsing Iranian behavior. It is using the relationship for purposes that have very little to do with Iran specifically.
Exactly. And this is where I want to introduce an important nuance about the limits of the Iran-Russia-China alignment, because I think those limits are as analytically important as the alignment itself. China does not want Iran to actually build and deploy nuclear weapons. A nuclear-armed Iran would destabilize a region where China has enormous economic investments, not just in Iran but across the Gulf, in Saudi Arabia, in the UAE, in Iraq. It would potentially trigger a regional nuclear proliferation cascade that would make the entire Middle East dramatically less predictable and more dangerous for Chinese interests. China wants Iran strong enough to resist American pressure and cheap enough to remain a compliant energy supplier. It does not want Iran powerful enough to become a genuine regional hegemon that China cannot manage.
And Russia has its own set of limitations in how far it wants to empower Iran. Can you speak to those?
Russia's limitations are geographic and strategic. Iran and Russia are not natural allies. They are neighbors with a long history of competition and mutual suspicion. Russia has significant interests in the Caucasus and Central Asia, where Iranian influence is also present. A dramatically more powerful Iran, with advanced Russian military technology and growing regional reach, could complicate Russian interests in Azerbaijan, Armenia, and the Central Asian republics. Russia wants Iran as a useful partner in specific contexts: Syria, Ukraine logistics, UN Security Council coordination. It does not want Iran as a peer competitor in its own near abroad. The relationship is genuinely cooperative within those limits, but the limits are real.
So the picture that emerges is not a tight, coordinated axis of powers with a unified strategic vision. It is something more complex. 3 states with overlapping but not identical interests, cooperating where their interests converge and managing their tensions where they diverge. Held together not by shared ideology or deep trust, but by a shared interest in limiting American power and preventing the kind of externally driven political change that each government fears could one day be applied to itself.
That is precisely the right characterization. And I would add one final dimension that I think is essential for your audience to carry forward into the rest of this conversation. The Iran-Russia-China alignment is not static. It has deepened significantly since 2022, driven by the Ukraine war and by the accelerating US-China competition. But it remains fundamentally opportunistic rather than principled. If American power were to decline significantly, or if the strategic environment were to shift in ways that made the relationship with Iran more costly than beneficial for either Moscow or Beijing, both would recalibrate without great hesitation. Iran understands this. Iranian strategic culture, shaped by that deep institutional memory of being used and discarded by outside powers, makes Tehran genuinely aware that its current partners are not unconditional friends. They are rational actors pursuing their own interests, and so is Tehran.
That final point, that Iran is as clear-eyed about its partner's limitations as we should be, is an important corrective to the narrative that frames the Russia-China-Iran relationship as a monolithic, anti-Western bloc. It is more fragile, more transactional, and more internally complicated than that framing suggests. And as we move forward, we are going to see how that complexity plays out across the Middle East itself, because the most emotionally charged, historically rooted, and strategically volatile dimension of the global Iran divide is not between Washington and Beijing. It is inside the region. It is the rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And that rivalry has dimensions, religious, ethnic, political, and military, that make everything we have discussed so far look relatively straightforward by comparison. We have mapped the great power dimension of the Iran divide, the United States, Russia, China, and the structural competition that shapes how each of them engages with Tehran. Now, I want to bring the conversation closer to the ground, into the region itself, because the most visceral, the most historically embedded, and in many ways the most consequential dimension of the global divide over Iran is not a great power competition. It is a regional rivalry. the conflict between Iran and Saudi Arabia. These two countries have been locked in a competition for decades that touches religion, ethnicity, political ideology, and raw military power all at once. Professor Nasseri, when you look at the Iran-Saudi rivalry in its totality, what is the most important thing to understand about it?
The most important thing to understand is that it is not one conflict. It is several conflicts layered on top of each other, and those layers reinforce each other in ways that make the rivalry extraordinarily durable and extraordinarily difficult to de-escalate. You have a religious dimension, an ethnic dimension, an ideological dimension, and a classic great power competition for regional dominance, all operating simultaneously, all drawing on the same set of historical grievances and strategic anxieties. When analysts try to reduce the Saudi-Iranian rivalry to any single one of those dimensions, they invariably miss the others. And missing any one of them produces a fundamentally incomplete picture of what is actually driving the conflict.
Let's take those dimensions one at a time, because I think that structured approach will help our audience build a clear mental model of something that can easily become overwhelming in its complexity. Start with the religious dimension, because that is the one that gets the most attention in Western media coverage. What is the Sunni-Shia divide, and how much does it actually explain about the Saudi-Iranian conflict?
The religious dimension is real, historically significant, and genuinely important, but it is also consistently overstated and frequently misrepresented in Western media. Let me give your audience the foundation. Islam is divided into two main branches. Sunni Islam represents approximately 85 to 90% of the world's Muslim population. Shia Islam represents roughly 10 to 15%, concentrated primarily in Iran, Iraq, Bahrain, Lebanon, and parts of Yemen, Pakistan, and Azerbaijan. The theological differences between Sunni and Shia Islam are real and rooted in a dispute that goes back to the 7th century, specifically, a disagreement about who should have led the Muslim community after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. Iran is the world's largest Shia majority nation and considers itself the center and guardian of Shia Islam globally. Saudi Arabia controls Mecca and Medina, Islam's two holiest sites, and considers itself the center and guardian of Sunni Islam globally. When Khomeini's 1979 revolution explicitly called for Islamic revolution across the Muslim world, not just among Shia communities but among all Muslims, Saudi Arabia correctly understood this as a direct challenge to its own religious legitimacy and political authority. The Iranian Revolution was saying, implicitly but unmistakably, that the Saudi model of Islamic governance was corrupt, subservient to Western powers, and unworthy of leading the Muslim world. That message has never been withdrawn, and it has never been forgiven.
And yet, you said the religious dimension is overstated. If the conflict has those deep theological and legitimacy roots, why do you caution against making religion the primary explanatory framework?
Because both governments consistently instrumentalize the religious dimension for political purposes, and recognizing that instrumentalization is essential for accurate analysis. When Saudi Arabia funds Sunni religious institutions and political movements across the Muslim world, it is not doing so purely out of theological conviction. It is building transnational political networks that extend Saudi influence and counter Iranian influence. When Iran presents itself as the defender of oppressed Shia communities from Bahrain to Lebanon to Yemen, it is not doing so purely out of religious solidarity. It is creating political constituencies and strategic assets in countries where it would otherwise have no leverage. Religion provides the mobilizing language. Power is the underlying objective.
That distinction, religion as mobilizing language, power as underlying objective, is a crucial analytical tool, and it applies to the proxy war dimension of the Saudi-Iranian rivalry, which is where the abstract competition becomes concrete and deadly. Walk us through what that proxy network looks like across the region.
The proxy war dimension of the Saudi-Iranian rivalry spans virtually every major conflict zone in the Arab world, and understanding it requires seeing these conflicts not as separate events, but as theaters in a single regional competition. Yemen is the most direct and most devastating example. Since 2015, Saudi Arabia has led a military coalition fighting against the Houthi movement in Yemen. The Houthis, formerly known as Ansar Allah, are a Zaidi Shia political and military movement that emerged from northwestern Yemen and have received substantial Iranian support in the form of weapons, funding, military training, and strategic advice. The Saudi-led intervention was driven by the fear that a Houthi-controlled Yemen on Saudi Arabia's southern border would give Iran a military platform from which to threaten Saudi territory directly. The Yemen conflict has produced one of the world's worst humanitarian catastrophes. Hundreds of thousands of deaths, millions facing famine conditions, an entire country's infrastructure systematically destroyed. And it has demonstrated both the limits of Saudi military power and the effectiveness of Iran's proxy strategy. The Houthis have launched ballistic missiles and drone attacks deep into Saudi territory, striking oil infrastructure, airports, and civilian areas. They have disrupted global shipping in the Red Sea in ways that have affected supply chains far beyond the region. Iran has achieved significant strategic effect in Yemen at relatively low direct cost. The Houthis bear the human and material burden of the fighting, while Iran provides the capabilities that make them dangerous.
Lebanon is another critical theater, and Hezbollah, Iran's most powerful and most sophisticated proxy, operates from Lebanese territory in ways that directly affect the broader regional balance. How central is Hezbollah to understanding the Saudi-Iranian rivalry?
Hezbollah is central in a way that goes beyond its military capability, significant as that is. Hezbollah represents Iran's most successful long-term strategic investment, a relationship built over more than 40 years that has produced a military and political organization that is simultaneously a Lebanese political party, a social services provider, a regional military force, and an Iranian strategic asset. Hezbollah has an estimated arsenal of over 100,000 rockets and missiles pointed at Israel. It has fighters with combat experience from Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. It has intelligence capabilities that rival many state services. And it has effectively paralyzed Lebanese state institutions to the point where Lebanon cannot make fundamental political decisions without Hezbollah's consent. From the Saudi perspective, Hezbollah's dominance in Lebanon represents Iranian power projection directly into the Arab world's Mediterranean flank, a permanent Iranian military presence in a country that should, by geography and demography, be part of the Arab rather than the Iranian sphere of influence. Saudi Arabia has spent enormous financial resources trying to maintain a Sunni political counterweight in Lebanon, most visibly through its relationship with the Hariri political family, and has consistently been outmaneuvered by Hezbollah's organizational discipline and Iranian strategic patience. Lebanon is, in many ways, the most visible symbol of Saudi Arabia's difficulty competing with Iran's proxy model.
Iraq is another country where this competition plays out with enormous consequences. And Iraq is particularly interesting because it is a country that borders both Iran and Saudi. Arabia has a Shia majority population and went through an American invasion that fundamentally altered its political landscape in ways that dramatically benefited Iranian influence.
Iraq is perhaps the most consequential single theater of the Saudi-Iranian competition, and the irony of the American role in creating the current situation cannot be overstated. Before 2003, Saddam Hussein's Sunni-dominated government served as a strategic buffer against Iranian influence, which is one of the reasons the United States supported it during the Iran-Iraq War, as we discussed. The 2003 American invasion removed that buffer, empowered Iraq's Shia majority for the first time in the modern state's history, and created a political vacuum that Iran filled with extraordinary speed and skill. Iran had spent years cultivating relationships with Iraqi Shia political and religious figures, many of whom had lived in exile in Iran during the Saddam years. When the old order collapsed, those relationships translated immediately into political influence. Today, Iranian-backed Shia militia groups, collectively known as the Popular Mobilization Forces, are formally incorporated into the Iraqi state security structure while maintaining independent command relationships with the IRGC. Iranian-aligned political parties are major players in the Iraqi parliament. Iranian economic influence in southern Iraq is pervasive. Iraq buys Iranian natural gas for its electricity grid. The border between Iran and Iraq is the most economically active border Iran has. From Tehran's perspective, the American invasion of Iraq was a strategic gift of historic proportions. From Riyadh's perspective, it was a catastrophic miscalculation that handed Iran its most important regional victory without a single Iranian soldier crossing a border in combat.
Given all of that, the Yemen war, the Hezbollah dynamic, the Iraq situation, the 2023 China-brokered normalization agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia came as a genuine surprise. To most analysts, two countries with that depth of rivalry, that history of proxy conflict, agreeing to restore diplomatic relations. What actually happened there, and what does it mean?
It was surprising, and I think the surprise itself is analytically instructive. The normalization happened for reasons that had more to do with exhaustion and economic pragmatism than with any genuine strategic reconciliation. Saudi Arabia under Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman had invested enormous financial and military resources in the Yemen war and had achieved very little. The Houthis had not been defeated. Saudi territory continued to be attacked. The humanitarian catastrophe was generating international criticism that complicated Saudi Arabia's efforts to present itself as a responsible regional leader and attractive investment destination. Riyadh needed an exit ramp from a conflict it could not win, and reducing tensions with Iran was a necessary condition for that exit ramp. On the Iranian side, the economic pressure of sanctions and the domestic political turbulence following the 2022 uprising made a period of reduced regional tension strategically convenient. Iran did not need to fight on every front simultaneously, and the choice of China as mediator, rather than the United States, was itself a significant signal. Both Iran and Saudi Arabia were demonstrating that they could manage their own regional affairs without American involvement, which suited Beijing's ambition to present itself as a constructive global diplomatic actor, and suited both Tehran and Riyadh's interest in reducing their dependence on Washington as the region's ultimate arbiter.
But the normalization has not resolved any of the underlying conflicts. The Houthis are still launching attacks. Hezbollah is still armed. Iranian influence in Iraq has not diminished. What is the actual status of the Saudi-Iranian relationship right now, beneath the diplomatic surface?
Beneath the diplomatic surface, the fundamental tensions are entirely intact. Saudi Arabia still views Iran's nuclear program as a potential existential threat. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman stated explicitly that if Iran develops a nuclear weapon, Saudi Arabia will pursue one as well. Iran still considers Saudi Arabia an American client state whose political model represents everything the Islamic Revolution opposed. The proxy relationships, Houthis, Hezbollah, Iraqi militias, have not been dismantled. What the normalization produced was a tactical de-escalation, a mutual decision to reduce the temperature and explore areas of limited cooperation, particularly in trade and consular matters, without addressing any of the structural issues that drive the rivalry. It is a ceasefire in the diplomatic relationship, not a peace agreement.
And the normalization's broader significance, the fact that it was brokered by China rather than the United States, speaks to a theme we have been developing throughout this conversation. The Iran divide is reshaping not just regional alignments, but the architecture of global diplomacy itself. The assumption that the United States is the indispensable mediator for Middle Eastern affairs, an assumption that has structured American foreign policy for decades, is being actively challenged. And that challenge is coming not through military confrontation, but through the patient. Construction of alternative diplomatic frameworks. As we move forward in this conversation, that theme is going to become increasingly important. Because the next relationship we need to examine, the relationship between Iran and Israel, te kranin, huestorn, takes everything we have discussed and adds a dimension of immediate military danger that makes this Saudi-Iranian rivalry, for all its destructiveness, look almost manageable by comparison. We have been building a picture of the Iran divide layer by layer, the historical foundation, the US-Iran fault line, the Russia-China alignment, the Saudi-Iranian rivalry. Each layer has added complexity and depth to our understanding of why the world responds to Iran so differently. But now we arrive at the relationship that I think carries the highest immediate military risk of any dimension we have discussed. The relationship between Iran and Israel. Because this is not a conflict managed primarily through proxies and diplomacy, as the Saudi-Iranian rivalry largely has been. This is a conflict that has crossed into direct military exchange, that involves explicit threats to national existence, and that has a nuclear dimension underneath it that makes every escalation potentially catastrophic. Professor Nasseri, where does the Iran-Israel conflict actually begin?
It begins, perhaps surprisingly, with a warm relationship. Before 1979, Iran and Israel had genuinely close ties. The Shah's government and the Israeli state shared a set of strategic interests that made cooperation rational. Both were non-Arab powers in a region dominated by Arab nationalism. Both were concerned about Soviet influence, and both maintained close relationships with the United States. Israel provided Iran with agricultural technology and military expertise. Iran provided Israel with oil. There were direct flights between Tel Aviv and Tehran. Iranian Jews maintained a visible and relatively secure community inside Iran. The idea that Iran and Israel are natural, permanent enemies is historically false. The enmity is a product of 1979, not of ancient civilizational conflict.
And the 1979 revolution ended that relationship immediately and completely. What did Khomeini's government do to signal the nature of the new relationship with Israel from the very beginning?
The signal was unambiguous and immediate. One of the first acts of the revolutionary government was to hand over the Israeli embassy in Tehran to the Palestine Liberation Organization, which established its mission there. Khomeini declared Israel an illegitimate state, a colonial implant in the Muslim world that had no right to exist. This was not a nuanced foreign policy position. It was an ideological commitment embedded in the revolutionary government's foundational identity. And critically, it was not simply a statement about Palestinian rights or about the specific borders of the Israeli state. It was a denial of Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state in any form, within any borders.
And that position has been maintained, with varying degrees of rhetorical intensity, by every Iranian government since 1979. But the rhetoric became particularly alarming internationally during the presidency of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad in the 2000s. Can you speak to that period and why it mattered so much for how the international community understood the Iran-Israel conflict?